Over to you.
Brethren, welcome to Shabbat services, and today is the 21st day of counting. It is the 7th day of the 3rd week, and it is the 3rd Sabbath of counting. So we are progressing towards the day of Pentecost, and we are also at this time continuing in our Bible study series on our statements of understanding. Now this week's message is on the symbols of our faith, and it's a slightly complex message. There's a lot of preamble to lead us into this, so let's go straight into the message, and let me give you the lead in to the core element of this message. So let us think about the traditional Christian year. If you think about it, the Christian year begins in December with the Christmas, the Nativity, the birth of Messiah. It then goes through into the spring, through the period of Lent and to Easter, and then after sort of the end of April, we have that long fallow period where the Christian church just sort of keeps on trucking until it gets through to the fall again, and then it starts to look forward to the Christmas period. So the standard Christian festivals are Christmas, Lent and Easter. That's what we have typically grown up with. And let's look at the sort of symbols that we see for the Christian celebration, the Christian year. So let's look at the symbols. Firstly, we see Christmas, and typically Christmas is memorialized with the baby in the manger, the nativity scene, and Mary and Joseph going to the inn where there is no room for them. And we also see that the Christmas story, the biblical story, gets mixed up with the traditional secular festivities. And this is a great picture. It shows the baby Jesus with Mary the mother inside a ornament that we would typically hang on a Christmas tree. So again, that fairly much typifies the Christmas message. And of course, here's a great example: Santa Claus kneeling down before the nativity scene to celebrate the traditional Christian Christmas. And there are many children nowadays who firmly believe that Santa Claus is mentioned in the Bible. It shows the level of biblical ignorance we have in our society, but it also shows how well the secular world has marketed itself into our Christian understanding. Okay. So we have the traditional or the common image of Santa Claus, Jesus, Mary, the reindeers, Joseph, and the Christmas presents. So that is typically what we see at the time of year, at this time of year. Then after Christmas there is a fallow period, and then we come to the next of the Christian festivals, Lent. And Lent traditionally starts on Shrove Tuesday. In English societies, Shrove Tuesday is known as Pancake Day, and it is the festival when all of the sweets and the pleasant foods are eaten up and consumed, because immediately after Shrove Tuesday we have Ash Wednesday. And many, what we call high Anglicans, many people who are versed in the Catholic tradition, many people who are stout traditionalists, will actually be marked with the sign of the cross in ash on this day to symbolize the beginning of the 40-day period of Lent, the 40-day fasting and mourning, and the time of introspection, the time of self-denial for the period of Lent. And as we see from these contemporary images, 40 days of getting close to Jesus, 40 days of prayer and fasting and doing works of love. So this period of 40 days of introspection leading up to the Easter message. And then after these 40 days, we obviously come to the Easter Sunday, and the classic Christian archetypes of this period: the cross, the crown of thorns, Easter eggs. And if you actually look inside the Easter eggs, we see the resurrected Jesus, we see a bunny, and we see an angel. These are typical of the Christian symbols that we would see at this time of year when we think about the crucifixion, his death on the cross, the Good Friday to Easter Sunday period in the ground, the resurrection, the Easter bunnies, the Easter egg hunts, the hot cross buns. All of these things we associate with the traditional Christian celebration of Easter. So that is what we commonly see as the most obvious symbols of mainstream Christianity. But the question we have to ask is, are they the symbols that Yehovah wants us to use as symbols of our faith in him? Well, let's look at another series of symbols, and let's look at where these symbols come from and how we need to be cautious about them. So let's look at the sign of the cross. You see on the top there the 5 different crosses are all derivations of the sign of Tau. Tau is a sun god, and the various crosses there, starting with a simple cross that we recognize as what would be called the Latin cross, through to the cross with a circle, which we see as one of the signs of sun worship, so the circular sun rising above the cross. And in fact the cross itself was symbolic of the rays of the sun, until we come to the final one with a cross actually inside the sun. And then if we look at the second image on the left, we see the various signs of the cross. So we see the Tau cross, we see the sun cross, we see the Latin cross, we see the Egyptian cross, the Ankh, which is symbolic of fertility, and we see the Celtic cross, which again we can see the rays of the sun coming out of the circle, and indeed even down to the swastika, which is in ancient symbolism was a sign of good luck. It symbolized the arms on the cross symbolize the fiery sun, the rays coming out of the fiery sun. So all of these crosses in their original form were intended to symbolize the sun in some aspect. And you can actually see in that image on the right the traditional pagan calendar, the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. And these were the high days of the pagan religions. They represented changes to the agricultural seasons, and they were venerated for the passage of the sun, and the sun growing in intensity from the spring to the summer, and then waning from the autumn to the winter, and going into the fallow period of the winter, and then being reborn again in the spring. So we can see the cross, we can see the sun, we can see the symbolism all associated with pagan sun worship. But now let's look at this. Let's look at the Christian adoption. Look at that image on the top right. YHWH, with the cross and the flames of the sun. Now that is an almost identical representation to the previous image of the sun, the cross in the sun, representing the sun's rays. YHWH comes from the Latin Iosus, from the Greek Iosus, which is the Greek version of the name of Jesus, which obviously we reject. But you can see how sun worship has been adopted into mainstream Christianity. The symbol there, he is risen, the rays of the sun obviously rising through the cross, through the execution cross, and indeed the Easter morning sunrise service, which is becoming common in many Christian assemblies. So we can see that bringing the rising sun, bringing the risen sun into the Christian worship on this time of Easter is a very, very common thing. So what does Yehovah tell us about that? Well, let's start by turning in the scriptures to the book of Ezekiel. Let us go to Ezekiel chapter 8, and we will start in verse 13. Ezekiel 8, starting in verse 13. And he said to me, turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing. So he brought me to the door of the north gate of Yehovah's house. And to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you will see greater abominations than these. So he brought me into the inner court of Yehovah's house. And there at the door of the temple of Yehovah, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs towards the temple of Yehovah, and their faces towards the east, and they were worshipping the sun towards the east. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. They have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. So imagine the symbolism here. If you understand from the teachings we've done on the tabernacle and on the temple or the tabernacle was aligned on an east-west axis. The northern wall, the table of showbread was on the northern side of the tabernacle, the menorah was on the south side, the altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant were on the western end of the tabernacle, and the way into the tabernacle, after you'd passed the brazen altar and the laver of washing, the way in was through the south side of the tabernacle. So these men who were entering into the temple were walking up the steps backwards because they considered, in their pagan understanding, they considered it an offense to turn their back on the sun god. So they turned their back on Jehovah, they turned their back on the Ark of the Covenant, so as not to turn their back on the sun god. And in England, where we grew up, where we were raised, many of the old churches were lined exactly on a perfect easterly direction. And the argument was, well, all the churches faced east because that is pointing to Jerusalem. Well, that's a nice theory, and the Masons of the days did a very good job in aligning the church foundations to the pure easterly direction. The problem is, if you draw a line from England to Jerusalem, it's actually a southeasterly direction. So it's a good 45-degree error. And when you actually do the calculations and look at the alignment of the nave of the old-fashioned English churches, they were accurate to true east to within a couple of minutes of arc. So the Masons were very, very skilled at aligning their buildings. And to say that, well, they didn't know in those days it was difficult for them to get the building right is utter nonsense. They aligned their buildings to within a few minutes of arc to be facing true east, and they would have easily known that Jerusalem was to the southeast. So an error of 40-odd degrees is untenable based on the skills they had in those days. So what do we see here? Well, we see in verse 16 it says, "And behold, the door of the temple of Jehovah between the porch and the altar were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of Jehovah, and their faces towards the east, and they worshipped the sun towards the east." Sun worship is the most basic pagan form of worship. We are not to partake of it, and we are not to bring it into our assemblies or into our services. But if you look at verse 14, it says, "Then he brought me to the door of the gate of Jehovah's house, which was towards the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz." Now Tammuz is the sort of the senior of the pagan gods. He is the son of Nimrod and Ishtar, and he symbolizes the corn harvest. He symbolizes the agricultural god. And in their tradition, he dies and he's in the ground for 3 days. And he's then resurrected and the new life starts. And there is a period when his mother, who was known as, I think, as Semiramis, who is the queen of the pagan pantheons, weeps for him. And this period of weeping for Tammuz takes 40 days. Now, if you look in the Bible, there are several times in the Bible when there are periods of 40 days of weeping, but nowhere are we commanded to observe 40 days of fasting, 40 days of remorse. The longest we're expected to afflict ourselves is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when we eat the bread of affliction for 7 days. The Day of Atonement, when we fast completely for 24 hours. But nowhere in the Scripture are we instructed to afflict ourselves for a period of 40 days. So the Lent, the purpose of Lent and the weeping and this day of this period of mourning, this period of self-denial, is drawn directly from the pagan tradition of weeping for Tammuz. And if we look, these are some of the images of Ishtar. Now, Ishtar is the mother of Tammuz. She is the Babylonian fertility goddess. And as you can see, if you're looking at that top left picture, you see in her hand, you see the circle, which symbolizes the rising sun. It's also symbolic of the Ankh, the Egyptian cross of fertility. You see at her feet she has the 2 owls. The owls present wisdom. They're also the symbol of Molech, And if you think, we were cast out the Garden of Eden because Satan deceived us into eating from the tree of knowledge. So the Molech, the symbol of wisdom, is part of this pagan symbolism. The story goes that Ishtar was sent to earth in an egg every year, and anybody who found her egg would be blessed abundantly for that year. And also the Ishtar story is associated with Venus. And if we look at Venus in the bottom right, that's Botticelli's painting. But again, you see Venus rising out the shell, again symbolic of the pagan egg from which Ishtar emerged. And if you look at the bottom left picture, you also see Ishtar with one of her symbols, that of the rabbit, that of the fertility. So eggs and rabbits and fertility all roll back to the goddess Ishtar. Okay, and the reason eggs become so prevalent is in the pagan sacrifices. They sacrifice children, and if you remember, we talked about the summer period, the solstice, the summer solstice, and the autumn and the spring equinox and the winter solstice. In the particular form of worship, in the Mithraic form of worship, in the sun form of worship, the priests would put on fresh clothing, and the Vestal virgins would wear bonnets to show that they were virgins. And then on the summer solstice there would be a pagan orgy, and any children that were subsequently born of that orgy were sacrificed. Eggs were soaked in the blood of the children, and those eggs were used as fertility symbols in the spring rite. So if you think about the children being conceived on the summer solstice in June, at the height of June, the children would be born at the spring equinox in the middle of March, and they would then be sacrificed during the feast of Ishtar in the springtime. So when we tell our children to go and look for coloured Easter eggs, we are actually remembering the child sacrifice of these pagan cults. And if you look how this has come into our terminology, in English the word is Easter. In the Anglo-Saxon it is Easteré. In the Babylonian it's Ishtar. In Hebrew it's Ashtaroth, and in Greek it's Astarte. So you can see how the language phonetically has developed over the years, from Ishtar to Astarte to Ashtaroth to Isteré to Easter. So we can see it's the same goddess. Now you can also see, if you look at that statue of Ishtar in the top left corner there, you see the horns on her head. They symbolize the Egyptian goddess, and that center picture is the goddess Isis, and she wears the horns. And if you remember, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, the first god they made for themselves was a golden calf. And so the horns of Isis represent the golden cow, which represents abundance, and the circle in the middle represents the sun. So again, they are symbolic of the sun god, and the Nimrod and Ishtar consider themselves to be the sun gods. They got the people to worship them as sun gods. The Egyptian pharaohs and their priesthood and their queens were considered to be gods by the people. They were manifestations of the sun god. In the Roman time, the Caesars were known as Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. And if we see how this has developed from Ishtar to Isis, and again Isis was known as as Queen of Heaven, Mother of God. Ishtar was known as Queen of Heaven, Mother of God. And we see in the bottom right the Catholic imagery and symbolism of Mary, who the Catholic Church call the Queen of Heaven, Mother of God. So you can see the symbolism here of the baby Tammuz being suckled by the Queen of Heaven. And at the time of the celebration, they gave each other, in this spring celebration, they gave each other cakes. And these cakes were made of sweet flavour. If you remember, they've just had 40 days of denial, 40 days of fasting. So they break their fast by giving each other cakes. And these cakes had raisins in them, they were sweet, they were flavoursome, and they were decorated with the sun's rays. And they had this cross baked into the cake to symbolise the sun's rays. And if you've ever been in or around any traditional Western church at the time of Easter, you will see people partaking of hot cross buns. And again, this is direct paganism that has been brought into the Christian celebration. It is sun worship. In no difference. It is purely sun worship with another name. So let's see what YHWH tells us about this. Let's turn back just a few pages to the prophet Jeremiah. And let us see what Jeremiah tells us in this situation. Jeremiah 44, and we'll start in verse 16. Jeremiah 44, starting in verse 16. As for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of YHWH, we will not listen to you, but we will certainly do whatever has gone out of our own mouth, to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and pour out drink offerings to her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes, in the cities of Yehudah, and in the streets of Jerusalem, for then we had plenty of food, were well off, and saw no trouble. But since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven, and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything, and have been consumed by the sword and by famine. And the women also said, and when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, and poured out drink offerings to her, and did we make cakes for her, to worship her, and to pour out drink offerings to her, without our husband's permission? Then Jeremiah spoke to all the people, the men, the women, and all the people that had given him that answer, saying, the incense that you burn in the cities of Judah, and in the streets of Jerusalem, you and your fathers, your kings and your princes, and all the people of the land, did not YHWH remember them? And did it not come to his mind? So YHWH could no longer bear it, because of the evil of your doings, and because of the abominations which you committed. Therefore your land is a desolation, an astonishment, a curse, and without an inhabitant. It is this day, because you have burned incense, and because you have sinned against YHWH, and have not obeyed the voice of YHWH, or walked in his law, or his statutes, or in his testimonies. Therefore this calamity has happened to you, as at this day. So in verse 17 we're told this, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goes forth out of our own mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven, to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, yet we and our fathers, our kings and our princes. Now if you think about that, if you explain the true biblical worship that YHWH expects, and you explain that to a practicing Sunday-keeping Christian, they'll say, oh, well, that's your Sabbath. Our Sabbath is on Sunday. That's your way of doing it. Our church does it this way. If you look at what it says in verse 16, as for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of YHWH, we will not listen to you. That is the attitude of the people in the church today. It says Israel is a stiff-necked people, and YHWH only gets his message through by bringing a rod of correction onto the back of Israel. And that time, brethren, is coming. As the paganism and as the corruption of our society gets thicker and thicker, YHWH will soon bring this rod of correction on his people, on the descendants of Israel, and he will let the world know that he is still in control, that he is still YHWH El Shaddai, YHWH Almighty, and he will bring his rod of correction on this people. But as for those who would partake of the pagan sun worship of Ishtar, with their sunrise services and their Easter eggs and their bunnies and their remembrance of infant sacrifice and the raisin cakes that they create in commemoration of the Queen in heaven, the wrath of YHWH will soon be upon you. So let's come to the end of the year, or what would be the end of the calendar year, the beginning of the Christian year, at what the Romans called the Feast of Saturnalia. And this was a festival at the end of the year. It started just after the winter solstice, so the shortest time of year, so when the sun was at its lowest power, round about the 21st of December. And if you look at astronomical tables, you see that the change in the sunrise and sunset condition is barely detectable for about 4 days after the winter solstice. And then after that period, after about 4 days, you see the sun beginning to get stronger. The sun rises a little bit earlier, it sets a little bit later. And so the Feast of Saturnalia was on the 25th of December. And the way the Romans celebrated it, it was a festivity. They gave each other gifts. It was an orgy. It was a time of drinking, of lust. It was a time of pagan sacrifice and pagan worship. And you can see that the symbolism of the tree and what in the Norse communities would be the Yule log, when they brought the Yule log into the house, and our celebration of the Christmas tree coming into the house to remind us of this period. And indeed the presents under the tree that again symbolize the Feast of Saturnalia, which has been brought directly from pagan worship into the homes of the vast majority of people who consider themselves to be Christians. And actually, when I put that picture on the slide there, you see the right hand picture with the Christmas tree. You see that big blue circle. When I first put the picture there, it actually reads, "Jesus is the reason for the season." And that is tragic. There are Christians who realize that the commercialism and the licentiousness and the excess of the Christmas period is not biblical, but still they go along with it anyway. And in their ignorance, they will come to destruction. And the other thing to bear in mind is, if we think about the fall festival that we are commanded to observe, the Feast of Tabernacles, we have a 7-day period. We start with a set-apart convocation. We have 7 days of celebration, and then that feast finishes with the 8th day. And the 8th day symbolizes the new heaven and the new earth. It symbolizes the new relationship between man and Yehovah. It symbolizes a new beginning. And if you think about the Christmas period, from the 25th of December to the 1st of January is also 8 days. And it is 7 days of Christmas, and then the last day is New Year's Day, which again we symbolize with Old Father Time and the new year, the baby of the new year coming in. Again, this comes from Saturnalia. It comes from the god of time, Kronos, and it symbolizes, again, yet another pagan festival. So everywhere we look, paganism is inherent in our society. And the Christians, because of the ignorance of Scripture and because of their stiff-neckedness and because of their desire to fit into society, quite happily go along and celebrate all of these pagan festivals, give them Christian names, and think Yehovah is happy with what they're doing. So let us see, is Yehovah happy with that festival? Well, let's turn back just a few pages, again in the book of Jeremiah, and this time we'll go to Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah 10, and we'll start in verse 1. Hear the word which Yehovah speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says Yehovah, do not learn the way of the Gentiles. Do not be dismayed by the signs of heaven, for the Gentiles are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are futile. For one cuts down a tree from the forest, the work of his hands, of the workman with the axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers, so that it will not topple. They are upright, like a palm tree, and they cannot speak. They must be carried, because they cannot go by themselves. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor can they do any good. So what does Jeremiah tell us about this? In verses 3 and 4. For the customs of the people are in vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold, and fasten it with nails and hammers, that it will not move. Now, how does that not define the Christmas tree? It is cut out the forest, it is brought out with an axe, it is brought into our homes by a workman, and then it is decked with silver and gold. And if you ever have been into a place where they have the tradition of putting the presents under the Christmas tree, and that was the tradition in my parents' family when we were growing up, when the whole family came together, all the children and the grandchildren, this sea of presents under the tree was quite frankly obscene, and it would take several hours for all these presents to be handed out. And every time you went down to get a present, you actually bent down and bowed before the tree to pick up your present. I mean, it's absolute paganism at its worst. And that's the way the vast majority of professing Christians conduct themselves in the eyes of Yehovah. So we looked at the Christian symbols, we've compared them to the pagan symbols, but surely as people who have biblical understanding, as people who accept Torah, people who understand the Old Testament, surely we are in a much better place than that. Well, as Messianics, let's look at the traditional symbol of the Messianic community, the menorah, the Star of David, and the fish of Christianity. And they see this symbol, you'll see this in many Messianic communities, you'll see it as jewelry, you'll see it on brooches, you'll see it on banners, you'll see it on ties. This is a very, very common symbol of the Messianic movement. Is this acceptable to Yehovah? Well, let's have a look. Let's turn to the first book of Samuel, and let us see if the Messianic symbol is an acceptable sign to use before Yehovah. 1 Samuel chapter 5, and we'll start in verse 1. 1 Samuel 5, starting in verse 1. Then the Philistines took the ark of the Mighty One, and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. When the Philistines took the ark of the Mighty One, they brought it into the house of Dagon, and set it by Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod arose early in the morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the earth before the ark of Yehovah. So they took Dagon, and set it in its place again. And when they arose early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen on its face to the ground, before the ark of Yehovah. The head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were broken off on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso was left of it. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon, nor any who come into Dagon's house, tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. So Dagon was the god of the Philistines. Dagon was the god. So when the Israelites took the Ark of the Covenant to battle against Jehovah's wishes, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured as a prize in that ill-fated war, the Philistines took the Ark into the temple of Dagon, and Jehovah made it very clear who was the superior god. On the first day, Dagon was knocked to the ground. The Philistine priest lifted him up again, nailed him back up. And then the second day he was knocked to the ground and actually broken in two. The head of the statue was broken off, the hands were broken off, and the Philistine priest and the Philistines came up with this tradition that they would not step on the threshold. And indeed, even that pagan behaviour carried forth. Certainly when I was growing up in England as a child, there was one of the poems that we would recite as we sort of walked down the roads was, "Step on a crack and you'll break your back." And we would not walk on the cracks in paving slabs because of this belief that had just passed through into common understanding from this period, from this pagan behaviour. And if we look at Dagon, so we see that it says that both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold, only the stump of Dagon was left to him. So we see how Yehovah demonstrated to all the people that he was mightier than Dagon. But let's look at this Dagon god and let's understand who he is. Here we see a priest of Dagon, and you can see that Dagon was known as the fish god. The Philistines were a coastal people, and so the fishing and the bounty from the sea was important to them. They worshipped Dagon as the fish god, and you can see that their priest dressed up to represent the fish. You can see the open mouth of the fish at the top of that priest, and then the scaly type shawl that they wore to represent the fish god. Now, can you see any similarity? The mitre of the Pope and the Catholic bishops is a direct copy of the hat worn by the priests of Dagon, and the hat that they wear is directly pagan symbolism to throw back their modern traditions to the pagan system that they still represent today. Now let's look at the next article. So when we think about the next article in the Messianic understanding, which is the Star of David, traditional symbolic synonymous with the Israeli people, with the Israeli people. So is this acceptable to Yehovah? Well, here you can see the classic symbol of the six-pointed star. What we are told is the Star of David, and you can see the classic two interconnected triangles, and this is where the Star of David comes from. And supposedly this was the symbol that David had on his shield. The problem is that is completely false. If you look at the scripture, the shields, David says in the Psalms, Yehovah is my shield. So if David was going to have anything on his shield, he would have had the name of Yehovah. It says, Yehovah is my shield and my strength. So where does this symbol come from? Well, this is in fact on the seal of Solomon. And the seal of Solomon was what he wore towards the end of his life. And if you know the story of Solomon, Yehovah spoke with him. Yehovah made him the wisest man on earth, the wisest man that ever lived. And he was commanded to follow the Torah. One of the requirements of Torah is that you do not take a wife from the pagans. Solomon took many wives from all the pagans, from the Gentiles around him. He took Canaanites and Egyptians and many, many women who brought their own behavior. They brought their own gods with them. And Solomon, but to the end of his life, became totally immersed in idolatry, totally immersed in witchcraft and mysticism. And this is actually part of the seal of Solomon. It's also known by another name, the talisman of Saturn. And if you look on the back of what's known as Solomon's seal, you see the six-pointed star. And if you look at the front of the seal, you see the pentagram. And for anybody that's ever watched a horror movie, you'll know that the pentagram is symbolic with witchcraft, with paganism, with devil worship. So what the Israelites are doing is, again, they are demonstrating to Yehovah that they will not have any part with him, that they are carrying on the sign of their false god, contrary to his commandments. And if we look at the book of Amos, it says in the prophet Amos, let's just turn there, Amos chapter 5 and verse 25, and let's see what Amos tells us about Yehovah's attitude to this behavior. Amos 5 and verse 25. Did you offer me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? You also carried Sikkoth your king, and Chion your idols, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. Therefore I will send you into captivity beyond Damascus, says Yehovah, whose name is the Mighty One of Hosts. So we see that even when Israel were coming out of Egypt, even when they were being brought out of paganism, they were being brought out of sin, they carried with them the symbols and the signs of their god, or their gods. Sikkoth the king, and Chion the idols, the stars which the gods which you have made, the star of your gods. So in verse 26 it says, but you have borne the tabernacle of Moloch, and Chion your images, the star of your god which you made for yourselves. And so Sikkoth and Moloch is the same name, it's the same god. We saw Molech as the god of wisdom, we saw the owl as being the symbol of Molech, and we saw the owls stood next to Ishtar. So we see how these pagan gods all come together, all integrate. And also, if you remember on that first image, we showed the archetypal Jewish symbol, the kippah. So, is that acceptable to Yehovah? Well, let's turn to the New Testament and let us see what Yehovah tells us about the wearing of kippah, or the yarmulke. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we will start in verse 2. 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I have delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Messiah is the Mighty One. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonours his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head, so that it is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. For it is shameful for a woman to be shaved or shorn, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image of the glory of the Mighty One, but woman is the glory of man. So, in verse 4 it tells us this: every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonours his head. So, brethren, if we are going to be true to Scripture, if we are going to be true to what we are told from the teachings of YHWH and YHWH and through the apostles, we should pray with our heads uncovered. Women should have their heads covered, and if we carry on and understand what it teaches in Corinthians, a woman with long hair is acceptable, a woman with short hair needs to wear a head covering, and that is what the Scripture tells us. And the other thing to look at, when we just look at these images, the yarmulke is put on that part of the brain, that on the back of the head, that symbolizes knowledge, that symbolizes wisdom. And again, the pagan priests and the mystics would wear a hat on the back of their head to symbolize their connection to this greater power. So even the position of the yarmulke is a symbol of connecting with arcane knowledge. And so it's something that everything about that is just totally contrary to what YHWH teaches us. And so we see from the messianic symbol, the fish is symbolic of the god Dagon. The six-pointed star is symbolic of the god Molech or Chion. So all we're left with there that has any relevance to YHWH is the menorah. So let's now carry on with this study, and let us look at what YHWH himself tells us to have as his signs and his symbols. So let's now find out what YHWH commands us to have as signs and symbols. Please turn back to the book of Exodus, and we'll go to Exodus chapter 31, and we will start in verse 12. Exodus 31, starting in verse 12. And YHWH spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am YHWH who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it is set apart to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, set apart to YHWH. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days YHWH made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So what is the sign that we are commanded to keep? In verse 13 we are told this: Speak also thou unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am YHWH, that doth sanctify you. So there's two things to notice in there. It says, Verily my Sabbaths. These are YHWH's Sabbaths. We have no right as human beings to change them, to modify them, to do them on a different day. This is the Sabbath that YHWH commanded. This is when YHWH requires us to come together, to be set apart, to worship him. If we turn up on Sunday, we're too late. The Sabbath is over, he is no longer paying attention to us, and we are not worshipping his Sabbath, we are worshipping a man-made Sabbath. And in fact, it is the day designated for worship of the sun god. So again, we are bringing ourselves back into paganism. But also notice this, look at this word, it says, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep. Sabbaths is in plural. Now we know about the weekly Sabbath, but what other Sabbaths do we need to be aware of? Let's turn to the book of Leviticus, and let us understand why this word is in the plural, the Sabbaths in plural. Leviticus 23, and we'll start in verse 1. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of Jehovah, which you shall proclaim to be set-apart convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Jehovah in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Jehovah, set-apart convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is Jehovah's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to Jehovah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So why is the Sabbaths in plural? Look at what it says in verse 3 and 4. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of Jehovah in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Jehovah, even set-apart convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. The Sabbaths, which has been referred to in Exodus 31, which is the sign between Jehovah and his people, include the weekly Sabbaths and the annual Sabbaths. So we need to be observing, brethren, both the 7th day weekly Sabbath and the 7 high days commanded to us in the book of Leviticus. And you'll know that we've recently observed the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You'll recall, if you remember, I started this message by declaring that this was the 21st day of counting. So we're now counting towards the day of Pentecost, to the middle of the high days. And then in the fall we will have the Feast of Trumpets, we will have the Day of Atonement, and we will celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles and the 8th day. These are the feasts of Jehovah. These are his Sabbaths. These are what we are commanded to observe as the sign between us and him. Now again, that's an attitudinal behaviour. That's a behaviour that we are expected to have. But these are the feasts we are to observe. But it also talked about now what we would see as being physical examples, physical things that we can use in our worship, that we can use in our adoration of Jehovah. And remember, the first of the fall feast is the Feast of Trumpets. And let us look at how the trumpet reminds us of the glory of Jehovah. So let's turn to the book of Joshua. Let's turn forward just a few pages to Joshua chapter 6. And we will start in verse 1. Joshua 6, starting in verse 1. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And Jehovah said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king, and the mighty men of valour. You shall march around the city, all your men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass that they make a long blast with a ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. And the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him. Then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Jehovah. And he said to the people, Proceed and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the ark of Jehovah. So it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before Jehovah advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of Jehovah followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came up after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I say to you, Shout, then you shall shout. So he had the ark of Jehovah circle the city, going around it once. Then they came into the camp, and lodged in the camp. So in verse 4 we're told this, And 7 priests shall bear before the ark 7 trumpets of ram's horns, and the 7th day you shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And we see in that picture there that the ram's horns, the shofar, is a central element of the tabernacle faith. We are commanded to sound the shofar on the feast days. We are commanded to sound the shofar, to call the people together. So the shofar is an element of our worship. It is a symbol of worship, and we know that also Jehovah used the shofar as an act of power to bring down this pagan city, Jericho, so that the children of Israel could safely pass. So if you are looking for a physical sign to have as a sign, the shofar symbolizes the trumpet of Jehovah. It symbolizes the voice of Jehovah. It symbolizes his might and his power and the power of his word. So it would be acceptable for you to have a shofar in your home as a symbol of the voice of Jehovah. Let's go back to the book of Exodus, because if you recall from what we just read, the shofar was carried before the Ark of the Covenant, and that leads us into a whole other group of equipment and items that Jehovah commands for his people. So let's go back to Exodus 31 and let us look at what Jehovah instructs his people to have in their worship. Then Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the spirit of the Mighty One, in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship, to design artistic works, to work in gold, in silver, and bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, in carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship. And I, indeed, I have appointed with him Ahoolab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have put wisdom in the hearts of all the gifted artisans, that they make all that I have commanded you, the tabernacle of meeting, the ark of the testimony, and the mercy seat that is on it, and all the furniture of the tabernacle, the table and its utensils, and pure gold lampstands with all its utensils, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering with all its utensils, and the laver and its base, the garments of the ministry, the set-apart garments for Aaron the priest, and the garments for his sons to minister as priests, and the anointing oil and sweet incense for the set-apart place. According to all that I have commanded you, they shall do. So here we're told about the tabernacle furniture, and in verses 9 to 11 it gives us this list. The tabernacle of the congregation, and the ark of the testimony, and the mercy seat that is thereupon, and all the furniture of the tabernacle and the ark, and his furniture, and the pure candlestick with all its furniture, and the altar of incense, and the altar of burnt offering with all its furniture, and the laver and his foot. And as we can see from this picture, the tabernacle furniture is set up with the altar of burnt offering, the brazen altar outside of the tabernacle, made of bronze, the laver of washing made of bronze, and then the entry into the tabernacle. And the first piece of furniture that we see is the table of showbread. Then we have the menorah, and then ahead of them, towards the top of the tabernacle, we have the altar of incense, and behind the second curtain we have the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat upon it. And this is the furniture that Jehovah says we are to use in our worship. And if you've heard my messages, I've covered each item of this furniture extensively. I have told you how they represent our journey from the carnal, from the profane, from the pagan world into the very presence of Jehovah. So again, if you want to have any symbols or any physical devices to remind you of your worship of Jehovah, you could have replicas of this furniture. But again, remember, this is furniture to assist us in our worship. It is not furniture which must be worshipped. We are not to have idols, we are not to bow down to idols. These are just tools to aid us in our worship and in our understanding. So let's think about the Ark of the Covenant. What was in there? Well, there's something very, very important. Let's turn forward to the book of Deuteronomy and let us understand what the Ark contained. Deuteronomy chapter 9, and we'll start in verse 1. Deuteronomy 9, starting in verse 1. Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today and to go in to dispossess nations greater and mighty than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven. A people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak? Therefore understand today that Yahweh your mighty one is he who goes before you, as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and bring them down before you, so you shall drive them out and destroy them quickly, as Yahweh has said to you. Do not think in your heart that Yahweh your mighty one has cast them out before you, saying, because of my righteousness Yahweh has brought me in to possess this land. But it is because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is driving them out from before you. It is not because of your righteousness or uprightness of your heart that you go in to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh your mighty one drives them out from before you, and that he may fulfill the word which Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore understand that Yahweh your mighty one is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people. Remember, do not forget how you provoked Yahweh your mighty one to wrath in the wilderness. From the day that you departed from the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against Jehovah. Also in Horeb you provoked Jehovah to wrath, so that Jehovah was angry enough with you to have destroyed you. When I went up into the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant which Jehovah made with you, then I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water. Then Jehovah delivered to me 2 tablets of stone, written with the finger of the Mighty One, and on them were all the words which Jehovah had spoken to me on the mountains, from the midst of the fire on the day of the assembly. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, that Jehovah gave me 2 tablets of stones, the tablets of the covenant. So we see here that in verse 10 it says, Jehovah delivered unto me 2 tables of stone, written with the finger of the Mighty One, and on them was written according to all the words which Jehovah spake with you in the mount out of the midst of fire in the day of the assembly. And from the studies we've done, you'll know that these 2 tablets of stone were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. These 2 stones, written by the very finger of Jehovah, on one side and then the other, were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant to act as the foundation of his mercy seat. The 10 Commandments form the foundation of the mercy of Jehovah, and they are placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. So if you are looking again at a physical sign, a physical symbol, if you choose to have some form of tabernacle furniture, remember the purpose of the furniture is to lead us to the Ark. Inside the Ark is the tablets of stone. The tablets of stone are the covenant. So what we should be holding fast to is the covenantal relationship. That is the sign, the Sabbath sign, the festivals, the 10 Commandments. These are the signs that we should be having with Jehovah and between his people. But there are other physical things that Jehovah does command us to have. Let's turn to the book of Numbers and let's have a look at what we're told in the book of Numbers. Back just a few pages, and this time we'll go to Numbers chapter 15 and we'll start in verse 37. Again Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels on the corners, And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of Jehovah and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined, and that you may remember and do all my commandments, and be set apart for your mighty one. I am Jehovah your mighty one, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to be your mighty one. I am Jehovah your mighty one. So what are we told here? Verses 38 and 39. Speak to the children of Israel, and bid that they make them fringes on the borders of their garments throughout their generations. And they put upon the fringes of the borders a ribbon of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of Jehovah and do them. These are called tzitzits. In the Jewish and Hebrew understanding, these tassels which they wear on their talit are made of white thread, and the scripture tells us to have a blue thread in them. The Jewish tradition is they leave them white because their argument is they've lost the knowledge of which particular colour blue they were to use, and therefore, so as not to get it wrong, they wear them just white. Again, Jewish tradition is getting in the way of the word of Jehovah. Jehovah says that the tzitzits, the tassels, are to have a blue thread. Jehovah says we are to wear them on the four corners of our clothing. And why do we do this? To remind us of the commandments. And if you remember, if you think about it, the tabernacle furniture reminds us of the commandments. It teaches us how to come into the presence of Jehovah. And when we come into the presence of Jehovah, we are at his mercy. And the foundation of his mercy is the commandments, the covenant. The tzitzits are to remind us of the covenant. If you remember the New Testament story, the woman who reached out and touched the hem of Yehoshua's garment, she was actually reaching out to the tzitzits. Okay? They're called wings in the Old English. They're called the wings of his clothing, the tassels. And when the sick woman touched the tzitzit, she was healed because the power flowed out from Yehoshua. But the purpose of the tzitzit is to remind us of the commandments. It's to remind us every day when we put them on our clothing that we are commandment keepers. We have chosen to be obedient to Jehovah and to observe his commandments. There's another article that we are required, or another thing we are required to do to remember the commandments. Let's turn forward into the book of Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy chapter 11 we're told this. Deuteronomy 11 starting in verse 13. And it shall be that if you earnestly obey my commandment which I command you today, to love Jehovah your mighty one, and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will give you the rain for your land in its season, and early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your new wine and your oil. And I will send grass in your fields for your livestock, that you may eat and be filled. Take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be deceived, that you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them, lest Jehovah's anger be aroused against you, and he shut up the heavens so that there be no rain, and the land yield no produce, and you perish quickly from the good land which Jehovah is giving you. Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land, which Jehovah swore to your fathers, to give them like the days of the heavens of the earth. For if you carefully do all these commandments which I command you to do, to love Jehovah your mighty one, to walk in his ways, and to hold fast to him, then Jehovah will drive out all those nations from before you, that you will dispossess greater and mightier nations than yourselves. And so in verses 20 and 22 it says, And you shall write them upon the doorposts of thine house. And what are we writing? We're writing the words that Moses told us. And what is the purpose of that? That ye shall diligently keep all the commandments which I command you, to do them, to love Jehovah your mighty one, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave unto him. So we are commanded to write the words on the doorposts of our houses. And the Jewish tradition is that we use a device called a mezuzah. And inside the mezuzah is a tiny scroll of paper which has the commandments written on them. And that's what we have on the doorpost of our house. And again, it is a perfectly acceptable symbol. But remember, the symbol is a reminder, and it is to remind us to be obedient to the commandments. So we need to understand this. All of these symbols, all this furniture, the seats, the tabernacle furniture, the mezuzah, are purely there to remind us of his commandments. Let's look at another scripture which gives us some more information about what we are to be observing. Let's go back to Exodus 3. So let us go back to Exodus 3, and we will start in verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert, and came to Horeb, the mountain of the Mighty One. And the angel of Jehovah appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, where the bush does not burn. So when Jehovah saw that he turned aside to look, the Mighty One called him from the midst of the bush and said to him, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is set apart ground. Moreover, he said, I am the Mighty One of your father, the Mighty One of Abraham, the Mighty One of Isaac, the Mighty One of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon the Mighty One. And what did Moses see? Moses saw a burning bush. And it says, the angel of Jehovah appeared unto him in a flame of fire, out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And the symbolism of the burning bush is captured in the menorah. And remember, the menorah is in the tabernacle. The menorah, if you remember from the teachings we've done before, symbolized the Spirit of Jehovah. It is his light coming into the world. And so again, if you want a symbol in your house, and as you know, we use menorah in our weekly services, we use the menorah in our high day services, and the light of the menorah symbolizes the light of YHWH coming into the world, and it's represented by this burning bush. So we can use the menorah as a symbol of the Spirit of Jehovah. Now some people say, well, the cross symbolizes YHWH, that's what we should be looking to, that's why we look at that. But remember, YHWH said, I must be lifted up. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must I be lifted up. So let's turn to the book of Numbers, and let's understand what Moses did and why he did it. So Numbers 21, and we'll start in verse 4. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against the Mighty One and against Moses, Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes this worthless bread. So Jehovah sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against Jehovah and against you. Pray to Jehovah that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. Then Jehovah said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent, and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten when he looks at it shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, and put it on a pole. So it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked on the bronze serpent, he lived. And in verse 8 we're told this, And Jehovah said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that anyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And if you look at that picture at the bottom, we can see the bronze serpent that Moses put on the pole. You can see it's a single upright pole, and the serpent is wrapped around it. And that icon, that image, has moved into popular culture, into modern culture, as the symbol of medicine. We see that symbol of the snakes intertwined around a single upright pole. And when we looked at the crucifixion story, we looked at the Greek word for the cross is stauros, which is a single stake. And Yehoshua was physically nailed to a single upright stake. He was wrapped around the stake, and his feet were then nailed to it. And the friction of his body as he wrapped around the stake kept him in place. So Yehoshua literally fulfilled what was said about Moses making the bronze serpent on a pole. Yehoshua did not die on a cross. The cross is the sign of Tau. It is the sign of sun worship, and Yehoshua was executed on a single upright stake. So let us bring this study to an end, and let us just look at two more signs or two more symbols that we have for those who are diligent and believe and desire to do what Yahweh tells them. So let's turn right to into the New Testament, to the book of let's go to the book of Revelation. We'll go to Revelation chapter 5, and we will start in verse 1. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a scroll written inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the scroll and to loose its seals? And no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look at it. So I wept much, because no one was found worthy to open it, to read or to look at it. But one of the elders said to me, Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals. And I look, and behold, in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of the Mighty One, sent out into the earth. Then he came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. When he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain, and have redeemed us to the Mighty One by your blood, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and make us kings and priests to our Mighty One, and we shall reign on the earth. So in verses 5 and 6 it tells us this, And one of the elders saith to me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book, and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of the Mighty One, sent forth into the earth. So we see here that Yehoshua is described as the lamb which had been slain. So a symbol that we are given in the Bible for Yehoshua is the lamb. And if you look at the beginning of that section, it says, Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And here we see a duality in the nature of Yehoshua, the lion, the pride, the might, the power and the glory, but also the humility and the sacrifice of the lamb. So if there was a symbol that you wanted to hold on to, the symbol of the lion and the lamb would be an appropriate symbol to remind us of the nature and the character of Yehoshua. But again, as a reminder and not as a talisman or as an object of worship. But finally, brethren, let us come to the ultimate sign of our faith, the sign that Yahweh tells his people to have. So let us go back just a few pages into the book of Romans. We're to Romans chapter 4, and we will start in verse 9. Romans 4, starting in verse 9. Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith, which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. And the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. So what is the sign that Abraham had? In verse 5 it says, "And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith." So Abraham's faith was recognized through the sign of circumcision. And Jehovah said the sign of circumcision was assigned to all the males of Israel throughout their generations. But we also were told in this section that his faith came before the circumcision. It's not the circumcision that gave him his faith, it was his faith that gave him the reward of the sign of circumcision. Now we as the New Testament, our faith is not in physical things, our faith is in the spiritual. So let's turn back just one page and go to Romans chapter 2. Romans 2, and we will start in verse 25. "For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, of the Spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from the Mighty One." So brethren, as we think about the signs of our faith, we think about the overt paganism which has infected every aspect of Christianity, from Christmas to Lent to Easter. Sun worship, child sacrifice and paganism infects every element of Christian celebration. We have studied the physical symbols of the faith. We've studied the shofar, the tabernacle furniture, the tzitzits, the mezuzah. All of these are physical symbols, and they bring us to the commandments. The physical symbols bring us to the commandments. But the true sign that we should hold fast to, the sign and the symbols of our faith, are the Sabbath, the annual high days, and the sign of the circumcision of our heart. And as it says in verse 29, "But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of the Mighty One." So brethren, let us seek the sign of Jehovah. Let us be circumcised in the heart, so that we may receive the praise of Jehovah. Amen.